Right, so it would appear that a bit of a nightmare for global justice has opened up at the International Court of Justice. Because the last thing we need is a president of the ICJ who is an out-and-out Zionist. And unfortunately it appears that that now is the case. For those who have followed the case brought by South Africa against Israel at the ICJ, you will know or recall that when it came down to a vote on the plausible case for genocide being committed by Israel against the people of Gaza, there was an overwhelming vote in favour of that. But there was also one lone dissenting voice on too many of these resolutions who voted against any and all allegations against Israel, even when the Israeli judge on the ICJ panel voted against his own country, Judge Julia Sebutinde of Uganda. With the president of the ICJ, Nawaf Salam of Lebanon, now having accepted the role of Prime Minister back in his home country under the new presidency there of Joseph Aoun, Julia Sebutinde, as Vice President, assumes that role of presidency now for the remainder of the duration of this elected term. The President and Vice President of the ICJ having been voted in last January, so for the next 2 years, that is, Sebutinde is President of the ICJ. And when I called her an out-and-out Zionist before, well, we now know an awful lot more about that when it comes to this judge, and frankly raises major questions over her ability to be impartial on this topic of Israel. Right, so Israel will be elated, I am sure, that the President of the ICJ is now Julia Sebutinde, a judge who has voted in Israel's favour at every resolution in their genocide case at the ICJ, even as the Israeli judge Aaron Barak could not bring himself to do that, as it now gets investigated for the plausible crime of genocide that was established at the ICJ a little over a year ago now, despite Sebutinde's dissent. The case having been brought, of course, by South Africa, a nation that knows a thing or two about apartheid, and Israel is very much an apartheid state. Sebutinde's appointment will now raise significant questions at how this case proceeds now, especially right at this moment in time when, with a ceasefire in place, ICJ investigators have a better opportunity than ever to get in to establish the facts, to investigate. She could now conceivably undermine that effort now. You have to remember what she voted against to understand how bad this actually is. She voted against the court ordering all military activity by Israel against civilians to cease. She voted against ordering Israel to cancel its then planned invasion of Rafah, where so many of Gaza's civilians were at that point trapped. She voted against Israel being made to stop forcibly displacing Gazan people, a war crime, and an ICJ judge voted against stopping that. In a previous advisory case on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestine, mandated on the court by the UN, Sebutinde had insisted that the Palestinians were not subject to military occupation at all, despite that being the case since 1967, and in her conclusions decided that Israel, actually in her view, had every right to maintain a permanent presence in the West Bank and all of Jerusalem on the basis not of law, but on what the Bible says, and gave this in her extremely lengthy written dissenting opinion, part of which was reproduced in an excellent Grey Zone article on this story, which reads, "There is substantial evidence that Jewish people lived in the region of ancient Israel between 1000 and 586 BCE. This period corresponds to the era of the united monarchy under Kings Saul, David and Solomon, and the subsequent divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The evidence includes archaeological findings in the city of David," Sebutinde insisted. "The Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, offers detailed accounts of the history, culture and governance of the Israelites during this period. While these texts are religious in nature, many scholars consider them valuable historical documents." This caused such widespread disgust back in Uganda that the Ugandan ambassador to the UN, Adonia Ayabare, published a tweet distancing her country from Sebutinde, saying back in January of last year that Justice Sebutinde's ruling at the International Court of Justice does not represent the government of Uganda's position on the situation in Palestine. She has previously voted against Uganda's case on the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Uganda's support for the plight of the Palestinian people has been expressed through Uganda's voting pattern at the United Nations. It got even worse for Sebutinde, though, when it turned out that according to Palestine researcher Zachary Foster, who has published a very detailed breakdown of Sebutinde's dissenting opinion on Twitter, that she has plagiarised various sections of her opinion from other works which she did not cite in her dissenting opinion in order to justify her own view, which has more to do with biblical claims than the burden of legal precedent. And that makes her, as Foster makes clear, an absolute joke of a judge who should be removed immediately. But why is Sebutinde like this? Why is she more Zionist than a literal Israeli judge was in this case? Is it bribery? Is it corruption? It's not as if Israel don't have a track record of blackmail and coercion after all. But actually, it seems indoctrination might be nearer the mark. And this was revealed in a glowing endorsement that she'd given in a book called Where Faith Lit the Way, written by Pastor Gary Skinner and his wife Marilyn, a book reflecting God's miraculousness in their lives, apparently. Gary Skinner being a Canadian who went and established the Watoto Pentecostal Church in the Ugandan capital of Kampala back in 1984. Sebutinde's endorsement of the work, only published last year, so following her ICJ judgment in January in relation to the South African case, read, "The godly values of integrity, honesty, justice, mercy, empathy and hard work that the Skinners and Watoto Church instilled and nurtured in me over the years account for who I am today and have immensely contributed to my incredible career as a judge in Uganda and a judge at the International Court for Justice." Well, really? Well, what kind of a church is it then? Well, as I just said, the Watoto Church was founded in 1984, and if you want a flavour of what it's all about, then listen to Gary Skinner himself.
Britain left Palestine, which they were looking after, on May the 14th, 1948. And on that day, little 4 or 5'3" David Ben-Gurion with his lion-like hair stood up and declared the Jewish nation reborn to be called Israel. For 2,400 years, no Jewish flag had flown over Israel until that day. For 1900 years, the nation had been out of Israel, scattered, but God fulfilled his prophecy by bringing them back. The greatest sign of the any moment return of Jesus. What is the land in the north? Moscow is exactly due north of Jerusalem. This is Bible prophecy about the times that we are living in, our generation. This is the most dramatic sign that Jesus is about to return. What's going to happen ahead of us? Israel is that barometer. What happens to Israel is a sign of the end time scenario. The national rebirth of Israel is the greatest end time sign we have. The rebirth of Israel tells us that God's plan for the ages is unfolding exactly as He's declared it would, on time. The next event is Jesus is coming back. He will take the church out of the sin-sick world and unleash His wrath against rebellious Israel and the Christ-rejecting Gentile nations. Half of Israel calls themselves secular.
Christian Zionist end-timers. God will unleash his wrath against rebellious Israel and the Christ-rejecting Gentile nations, he said. He and his church, who instilled and nurtured such beliefs, it seems, in Judge Julia Sebutinde, whose judgments have appalled so many in relation to Israel, but are very much supported by those close to the Watoto Church. An example being an Instagram post by Patience Rabwogo, which reads, "Not all heroes wear capes. Julia Sebutinde has made a historic stand at the ICJ. May God always remember her for mercy, and may Uganda as a nation always be found on the Lord's side." How very evangelical. Rabwogo just happens to be the daughter of the Ugandan president, whose wife is also very close to Watoto Church, which shows the influence the Skinners very much have in Uganda there, though, and by now extension at the International Court of Justice through Judge Julia Sebutinde, it seems. As president of the ICJ, Sebutinde has the power now to break a deadlocked vote, and if anyone is prepared to attempt to undermine the South African case against Israel in the ICJ, never have they been in a better position to potentially do so. We need to watch the ICJ in relation to Israel and Gaza like a hawk. Where Israel might be getting some good news from the ICJ, though, it's been less good news back home, where the toll is certainly now being taken with 2 ceasefires in place, those of Gaza and Lebanon, but both being seen within Israel as defeats for Netanyahu and his government personally. The return to fighting for him cannot happen fast enough, both to attempt to repair his standing in the eyes of Zionist Israelis, and more importantly, preserve his posterior in the chair of his prime ministership. He's not having a good few days, is Bibi. Oh dear, how sad, never mind. We get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content and help support this channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid therefore. Cheers folks.